Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about the Playmaster. All right. So I am introducing the concept of a Playmaster in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. All right. So what is this? So this is an idea that I think Dungeon Masters should consider implementing into their play, and it comes from my current experience with multiple games that I'm in right now, and also just not actually from my specific game. I think I think about Dungeons and Dragons at an aggregated macro level. So this is an aggregated macro level concern, right? So I want to talk about players, and that's where this concept of playmaster is. So I'll explain what's happening with players right now and why I think we should emerge the concept of Playmaster, inject it into Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition play, and begin using it as a dungeon masters. All right, let's go ahead. So, and all this is American specific. Okay, so let's talk about players. So, I think Dungeons and Dragons has a serious problem. Dungeons and Dragons is doing great, right? But it has a lot of problems, right? It has now they're all first world problems, trust and believe, but it has some serious first world problems. So let's get and you know what? I don't think first world problems should be ignored. Like, people in the first world are people too, right? It's not that like their problems don't matter, right? People say that but yeah, it's okay to acknowledge that it's a first world problem, but that don't mean it doesn't need a fix, right? So let's get into this. So, of course, the problem with Dungeon Masters is there's not enough good Dungeon Masters. Dungeons & Dragons is very aware of this problem, and they're trying to create good Dungeon Masters, but it's very hard to create good Dungeon Masters. The second problem is with players is what do we do with players? What is their value? There's so many problems with players. What is a player's value, right? What do we do with players, right? And what I'm talking about here is not dungeon masters who play, right? You don't need to fix their problem, right? They're dungeon masters who are playing to make their dungeon mastering better. Their play barely even counts, right? So it's just them getting good at dungeon mastering, right? I'm talking about dyed-in-the-wool players who never dungeon master, right? Who have the possibility of emerging as world-class players, right? Every player at your table has the possibility of emerging as a world-class player. So my daughter recently did an art chapel at a high school. It was truly incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And, I see my daughter just doodling around, drawing very high quality anime characters at home with very expensive markers and very expensive materials, right? But when I saw her at art chapel, I saw her with her art teacher, and it was like this art performance. And the first time I ever was like, she could be a Van Gogh. Like, my daughter is legit good at art, like not like world class, right? Like, she could genuinely be world class, right? And you need to think, and I think, and I have to say, I'm telling you this because I was very dismissive. Like, I just, seeing my daughter draw anime characters all the time, I was like, she's good at art. She may be very good at art, right? But I never really was like, oh my gosh, I've been through literally every corner of the Philadelphia Art Museum and every extended Philadelphia Art Museum. I know a bit about art. I know what world-class artists look like, right? And what their art looks like. And I'm like, yeah, she could be the next Van Gogh. Like, this is legit, right? But I had put in my head that was not the case, right? And I'm warning you, I know you're like, oh, ain't none of my knucklehead players going to be the best in the world, but you're wrong. You have 4 to 8 to 20 players, and one of them could be the best player that's ever played Dungeons and Dragons, right? And you are responsible to build a space where they can excel, right? And reach peak player, right? And by the way, we have never seen a peak player, right? I'll tell you right now, ain't none of those knuckleheads over on Critical Role even remotely, like, no question, Matthew Mercer is the best dungeon master in the world. Nobody in Critical Role is the best player in the world. I can guarantee that, right? I'm not convinced a single person in Critical Role has ever literally even read the player's handbook, right? So they can't be the best player in the world, right? Like, yeah, trust and believe there, right? But there's a distinct possibility that at your table, you have the next Van Gogh of Dungeons & Dragons players. And you are responsible as a dungeon master to build a space where they can excel, right? I kind of failed my daughter, right? I did not treat her as a world-class artist. Thank God her art teacher did, right? And really pushed her and didn't just nod and say, that's a nice piece, but was like, no, that sucks, do it again, right? Like, said it nicer than that. I'm sure our teacher didn't use those words, but pushed her, right? Like, and it's the same here. Like, what are we doing with our players? Are we building a space where they can excel, right? And one of the first things we can do to make a place where we can let the best Dungeons & Dragons player emerge, which I do not think has emerged. Like, if you ask the question right now to anybody, like in America, who's even remotely related to Dungeons & Dragons, and say, who's the best dungeon master in the world? There ain't going to be but one answer. They're going to say Matthew Mercer, right? And because he is, right? If you asked who's the best player in the world, you would get 1,000 answers, and ain't none of them going to be right, probably, right? Maybe one, right? But there's no consensus, and players don't even take their positions seriously enough, right? But if we bring in this idea of a playmaster, right, it starts this conversation saying, I am going to build a space for world-class excellence among you as players, and one of you is expected to emerge as the best Dungeons & Dragons player in the world, right? Because this slot has already been filled for dungeon masters, and as players, y'all need to start getting good and considering excellence, right? So what does a playmaster? So I've explained the need for a playmaster. What would a playmaster do? A lot of things, right? And I'm just going to mention one or two of them now, right? The biggest thing is they will be an advocate for the player group, right? Taking concerns of the players, right, and bringing them to the dungeon master in an aggregated form. All right, so first, and also organizing out of game discussion sessions with all players minus the dungeon master. So the first thing the player master would do is be in charge of organizing periods where the players could talk amongst themselves minus the dungeon master and plan out, right? What are the goals of our party, right? What are the goals of each and every one of you, right? And we now know these goals and the dungeon master doesn't. So we can support these goals in play through player character dialogue, right? And also if complaints of the player group, right, where the playmaster can hear the complaints of all the players about the dungeon master, and then, Sally, rather than Sally going, hey, I hate that you take your NPCs and make them the stars, and we as the player characters are never stars, not in the way your NPCs are. If Sally says that to the dungeon master, she will feel the dungeon master's wrath, right? But if the playmaster says, we have a group, have discussed this, and the group is asking, right, you to put less shine on your NPCs and put more shine on us as PCs. The playmaster already has an elevated respect, right, from the dungeon master over the other players, because they've demonstrated, they take notes, they do all the things a good player should do. They speak respectfully, they don't touch other people's dice, they don't cheat, right, and they get a level of honor from the dungeon masters that other players don't, right? And then you get this, and then they can have this request, right? And they could say, hey, we as a player group are asking you this. It's less personal, right? It's more professional. That's not the perfect word, but you know where I'm going with it. So I am introducing this concept of a playmaster. There's a whole lot of reasons that playmaster should be in existence, far more than I talked about today, but I think this is really needed, especially if we're going to find the best D&D player in the world. We need to start taking the player group seriously, and I think this is a good way to do it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.